So much for being with us. Welcome to the 5th session of the 8th Annual International Conference on Sustainable Development. I'm going to ask our panelists and our moderator, Radhika Iyengar, to get connected. Radhika is the Director for the Education Sector at the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, and today's session is Pathways for Progress in Climate Change Education in the U.S. Radhika, over to you. And Christina, I should have also said we have two wonderful moderators today, Christina Kwok as well. Apologies.
Thank you, Lauren. It's a pleasure to be with our esteemed panelists, along with my very talented co-moderator, Christina Kwok from the institution. Thank you all for joining this panel on pathways for progress towards climate change education in the US. Though it is in the US context, we will be asking our panelists to focus on international studies as well and bring insights from the international studies. So thanks for all for joining. Just a quick introduction and proceeding over to the structure for this particular panel. It's a little bit different from what we are generally used to make it very engaging. So Christina and I have come up with a very innovative structure. Let's see how it works. Welcome all panelists. We have Karine Ko from CEO 10 Strands. Iveta Silova is a professor at Arizona State University. We have Shakira Provasoli. She's a teacher, environmental education teacher in New York City School. Isabella Seckler, she is a second-year graduate student at Columbia University. And Frank Neopol is a climate education coordinator, NOAA's Climate Program Office. So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. Just to go over the structure of the panel, we will be focusing on climate change education in the US context. Part 1 will be the panelists doing an introduction about their work, and also will be focusing on getting us, opening remarks on this particular question that Christina and I have drafted. What are the key gaps in climate change education in the US system for both formal and for non-formal? And what is the need to strengthen climate change education? So that will be part 1. Part 2 will be a rapid fire round where every panelist will get about 3 minutes to discuss the questions that Christina and I will be posting to them. And part 3 is where we have the panelists talk to each other and they will have questions for each other. And I'm hoping that we will have some time remaining to take any burning questions from the participants. Christina will do the closing remarks, but I just to add on that we can definitely be in touch if there are any questions from the audience and participants. Christina and I are happy to engage with them. We will be posting this video on the ICSD website as well as our email IDs for further communications. Christina, any remarks from you before we start our panel?
Nope, I just am very delighted to see our panelists here and for us to get going with the discussion. Thanks, Radhika.
Great. So first part is with the panelists doing their own introductions and keeping the gaps in climate change education in mind for the US context. So we'll start with maybe Karen. Karen, do you want to start?
Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. A little choppy earlier with some people. So yes, I'm Karen Cow. I'm the CEO of 10 Strands, a California-based nonprofit. We actually, I'll be talking about environmental literacy. That's a term that we use in California, but we'll use it interchangeably with climate change education. So at 10 Strands, we basically 3 things we focus on. We advocate for the expansion of environmental literacy in California public schools. We help build the capacity of county offices of education and districts to integrate environmental literacy. And we foster a broad and inclusive network of support for environmental literacy. I'm also the project director of the California Environmental Literacy Initiative. That's a statewide public-private partnership of government and non-government stakeholders who are interested in catalyzing the field. We call it CALI for short. So CALI was formed to implement California's blueprint for environmental literacy, which was published in 2015. So we've been doing this work for 5 years solidly now. And my organization, 10 Strands, leads the philanthropic work, raising the money for the effort, both private philanthropy, but then also state. We also lead the advocacy effort, and we provide leadership support to a 30-person leadership council. Good news in California is that this work, this commitment to this work, environmental literacy, goes back to 2003. So we've been at it for a while now. California adopted environmental principles and concepts, which are big environmental ideas that express the interdependence of natural systems and human social systems that we want our children to deeply understand. So there's certainly a basis for the work here. And then obviously California is the largest state to have adopted the next generation science standards, which includes climate change in certainly high school, middle school, and proximally in younger grades. We also have a blueprint, as I just mentioned, and we've integrated our environmental principles and concepts into multiple subjects now: science, history, social science, health, the arts, and we're working on mathematics. And then importantly, we have a good policy base for the work. So at the end of 2018, our governor at the time signed some legislation that included into the prior law a priority to focus on climate change and environmental justice. So the gaps, good question. I think the three things that first came to mind were, and we can talk about them later, we will talk about them later, but I don't think there's enough instructional minutes given to science in general. You know, when you look at it compared to ELA gets about 89 instructional minutes a day in elementary school. Math gets about 57 instructional minutes, and science gets about 18 instructional minutes. And with distance learning, all of that is being exacerbated. It's tied obviously to testing as well. So it's one of the reasons why math and English get so much time. The second gap is I think we have a vulnerable non-formal sector, made even more vulnerable by COVID-19. They're incredibly important to environmental education, climate education, but they're not really seen by the formal system. And then the third gap, you know, I think even although we've done all of the work that we've done and there's a commitment flowing from our State Department of Ed, there isn't really any real recognition of education as a valid strategy for the governor in reaching his climate action goals. There needs to be more of a real investment made. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Maybe Frank, since I can see, you know, sequenced accordingly. Frank?
Sure. It's so great to be with you all today. I'm going to start a timer just so I can ramble on for a long time. So I want to make sure I don't chew up too much time. There's so much to be said here about this topic. So just so you know who I am, I'm Frank Niepold. I'm the NOAA's Senior Climate Program Officer and Coordinator. You know, in the U.S. government, you wear lots of hats. So I feel like I could go on and on about all the things I do without getting into the substance. But basically, my charge was to make the nation climate literate back in 2005. And we've been at it 15 years. We've made monstrous improvements from where we were in 2005, but we have so much further to go. The gaps, the more you do it, sometimes the more you understand how much more you have to do. We've made tremendous improvements and understandings of what would be our focus. We've moved way beyond just science in that 15 years. But that said, I think one of the biggest gaps I would want to focus on in this conversation is the formal education system is very slow to change. Very slow to change. And the climate issue is moving at a incredible speed. And so one of the challenges I'm focusing on right now is how do we provide access to all our students? And just to give you some context from wherever you are in this conversation, 1 in 4 people in the nation's a student. 1 in 4. And so that is a massive number of people that you need to serve. And mostly what we're hearing is our students are not getting served by the formal education system or the informal education system. That's something that access is really critical. There are some students that are getting amazing support on this issue, but that's not the case for most. And that's something that we need to change in the very near future. How we do that, that's something we can talk about further into the panel. But I think one of the other things we have to think about is that this work goes back a very far time. We've been at this, I can document work all the way back to the 70s, where climate change, global change, education has been there. And there's been about 5 waves of this. It's very wavy, this work. It comes and it goes, and it comes and it goes. And I think we might be in a long plateau that's coming, where we're going to be high as opposed to low. And I think that how we've used and learned in the last 15 years, at least, if not further back, will inform really the new work, as opposed to having to restart the learning where we start making sure everybody understands the science. We've moved beyond that. That's important, but it's not the full understanding. And I think that there's also an unevenness in our geographies, in our communities, whether it's rural or urban or coastal or the center of the country. We have this very uneven, and it is moving too slowly for the issue. So those are the key points I would want to just set you guys up on this conversation. So I've gone through my 3 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Frank, and appreciate keeping on time. Iveta, you next.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to be on this panel. I'm looking forward to today's discussions. So I am a professor at Arizona State University, where I direct the Center for Advanced Studies in Global Education. And just as a little background, I was born and raised in Latvia and personally experienced Latvia's transition from the Soviet to the European Union. And I spent 10 years working in the field of international development before joining academia, living in Central Asia and the Caucasus. And I currently serve also as a president of the Comparative and International Education Society, which brings together over 3,000 education researchers, practitioners, and policymakers worldwide, and which dedicated our last 2 annual conferences to examining the role of education in the current climate crisis. But generally, my work has culminated into the research agenda and approach that tries to overcome not only the research and practice dichotomies, but also the divisions between education and empirical social sciences, as well as Western and non-Western perspectives on education. So these principles also frame my work around climate change education. Well, I think that the main problem of climate change education in the United States, but also elsewhere, is related to our failure to critically interrogate the deeper assumptions underlying our current education policies and practices. We operate on the assumptions that improving existing forms of education would positively impact environmental sustainability. This is the logic that informs education policy, not only in the United States, but also forms a foundation for sustainable development goals and informs agenda for many international development agencies. The idea is that the increasing access to quality education would automatically translate into changes in environmental awareness and behavior than would to environmental sustainability. However, this core assumption is highly problematic, given that the world is the most educated it has ever been, and yet the nearest to the environmental breakdown. At the heart of the problem, I think, is a de facto endorsement of and a continuing reliance on the education paradigm that prioritizes economic growth, technocratic determinism, human exceptionalism, and neoliberal individualism over environmental concerns. So for decades now, many scholars have argued that education in this current form actually is a central part of the environmental problem. And despite efforts stemming from the UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development, schools and higher education systems prioritize workforce supply for economic growth over environmental sustainability. And in the United States in particular, education policies explicitly predicated on an extremist version of human capital theory, once ascribing to an infinite growth paradigm. And more alarming, policymaking continues to be based on the assumption that there is no conflict between continued economic growth and environmental sustainability. So from this perspective, the key problem in my mind is our failure to acknowledge that the business as usual of education is no longer acceptable, but also our collective failure to imagine alternative ways of living with the earth.
Very important points emerging already. Thank you, Vita, for your observations. Shakira?
Hi, everyone. My name is Shakira Privasoli. I've been teaching elementary school in New York, public elementary school, since 1999. I've had experience as a classroom teacher, K-3, and also as a K-5 environmental science teacher in an amazing lab like the one you see behind me here, built by New York Sunworks. So my students, I just posted in the question there, when did you first learn about climate change? Because it was not when my students did. We talk about climate change every day, and we can use different words to describe what's going on, but we talk about climate change every day. So I personally have written science curriculum. I also teach a course on sustainability for New York City teachers to get credit. I'm a Math Hub for America Fellow, and I'm a member of the New York City Elementary Science Leadership Team, as well as the Climate and Resilience Education Task Force, just like you, Frank. So I have to say that working with a wide range of educators from early career to master teachers, I feel like it provides me with a really deep understanding of the dire need for climate change education policy that teachers can actually use. So I'm going to explain that teachers don't need something extra to do. They need something that makes sense for themselves and for their teachers. And teachers need to be educated pre-service on specific strategies to seamlessly integrate facts and stories and projects related to climate change into their present curriculum. So teachers do not need a separate curriculum. We do not need standalone standards that will never intersect with what we're actually teaching. Teachers need help weaving climate change education into every classroom, every subject, every lesson. And I have to say that teachers may be willing to take on this Herculean task, but really cannot do so without being educated first. So teacher education must come first. And this teacher education needs to be ongoing, subject specific, and collaborative. And if we can do that, then we are definitely going to strengthen climate change education. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shakira, for those very important points. Thanks for bringing those up. And now we'll hear from a student who is actually living sustainability and similar climate education topics in her private and through her classes. Isabella?
Thank you so much for that introduction, Radhika. I have to say that it's really exciting and an honor for me to be here today speaking with you all. I remember very clearly last year for New York City Climate Week, looking up what the ICSD conference was and thinking, wow, this is really an important space where the conversations happen. And so it's really just an honor for me to be here and be part of the conversation today. I'm a second-year student in undergraduate at Columbia University. I intend to study sustainable development, but I'm also on a pre-med path. So clearly I am a student very interested in the interdisciplinary aspect of what sustainability means. And I'm very interested in the linkages between communities and their local environment, and specifically the role of communication in helping people realize their role as part of the greater ecosystem of humanity. And a lot of my interests and my background come from growing up in South Florida and living next to the ocean in an intercoastal environment. And I understand that many students don't have that experience. So whether it's a rural or an urban environment that they're growing up in, one of the biggest things for climate change education that I've realized is to educate students in terms that are relevant to them and really make this personal. And over the past year, I've really made it sort of a personal mission to take this outside of the classroom and learn what sustainable development means and what environmental literacy can mean to me in my own life, and also how I can share that with my peers. I got very interested in science communication, specifically through one perspective and principle of biomimicry, and I've been working with the Biomimicry Institute for the past several months as well. And the other large thing, and also very connected to the ISD conference, is SGS and Youth. So I am part of their global network, operating over 70 hubs at different universities around the world, trying to engage students in higher education with the Sustainable Development Goals, but more specifically, just introducing them into what a framework can look like for engaging with and taking action on sustainability issues beyond the classroom. And so I'm really excited to talk today about my personal experience about what this has meant and showing the different ways for how we can incorporate climate education into the existing curriculum, because it touches all different aspects of life, from the economics to the politics to the sciences. There are just so many aspects and complex factors of what climate is in real life. And I think one of the biggest factors that has shaped my perspective of this has really just been that education for climate change is not optional anymore. It's something my generation is actually living through, and we're seeing these impacts. So it is something that is very necessary to take into account today. And even you can take COVID-19, for example, there are just so many different factors going into this. And so students need to be able to think for themselves and have this holistic framework to unpack all of these issues in order to feel hopeful and have a pathway to actually solve these solutions. So I'm really excited to talk with the panel today and kind of reflect more on this later on.
Great. Thank you so much, Isabel, for your notes. Ina, over to you for the second part.
Great. So I think now we're going, I'm not sure if we lost Shakira. I hope it's just her video off. There we go. Good. So now we're going to go over to part 2 for some rapid fire questions. And I think maybe we're going to start with, let me just double check my notes. Starting with Isabel, right? And Veronica, over to you to start that question.
Isabel, thanks for sharing your observations earlier on. The question that I had for you is, we always see that the student has to take all the burden to compile all the resources and be networked and have that kind of information that is required to drive the change. So given that responsibility, how do you think, what kind of education do you require that you need for climate change education, and how do you think institutions can help you and your college can help you to get all the information that you require to bring that change in your life?
Right. Thank you so much for this question. And I definitely feel like I'm a student who can speak from experience here, because I am definitely someone who goes to a school where I'm so lucky to have such strong programs in sustainable development and what environmental literacy means. But even now, I've had to really take charge and take initiative to let my curiosity lead, to find the information. I think initially it's very important to note that with the internet, and if we can assume internet accessibility, especially in the US, and with the scale of online learning that we're all going through right now, I think the missing factor is really a passion for students, but more so just a curiosity. And I think that's where climate education that is personal and relevant to students is very important, for them to understand that learning about climate and learning about the environment is really just understanding their own role in something that will affect their own lives in a very personal manner. A common misconception of climate change, even that I experience with my own friends, is that it's really just an environmental issue. And while that in itself is a very important task that we should all care about, the concepts of greenhouse gas and carbon emissions and an increasingly energized world are not enough to prepare students to really understand what climate means today. As I said earlier, it's inherently political, it's medical, it's economic. This is a cultural issue. And so we really need to create an interdisciplinary framework for students to be able to take these many different perspectives and then find their own pathway for how they can apply what they're learning to climate. It's not saying that everyone has to be innovating different solutions for climate change, but in today's reality, it is something that we have to consider in almost everything we do. So I think the biggest thing is to make climate more personal, and in making it more relevant, honestly, it's just making it more local, giving students the ability to understand where they are in the world. For example, I grew up in South Florida, so I spent most of my time in high school working at a marine nature center. And it was a very simple decision I made, but then you fast forward 3 years, suddenly I found myself really taking on a charge of environmental stewardship, speaking to crowds of up to 250 people about the role of the coastal ecosystem that in the greater carbon emissions and carbon sequestrations, but really how the little tasks they can do show that they're connected to this environment and it influences them as well. And something that I've seen change as I've gone on from that into college, and especially as the global work that I'm now doing with STS and Youth in their SDG Students Program, the common theme there has really just been the role of strong and effective communication in allowing students to take on climate education in their own terms, in their own way. So you just need to be able to give students that personal spark in whatever they're interested in and whatever they can connect with, that will really give them a sense of agency. And I think that is what then propels them and motivates them to learn more about climate and other environmental issues. And the other important thing is to understand that, you need an interdisciplinary framework to approach these. So that's where the SDGs and sustainable development can really come into play in shaping how teachers interact with students. It's not just learning about, say, the economics of development. You can learn about economics through very specific case studies of our world. And I think one thing we're seeing now that's really great is classes are popping up on what is COVID and what is unpacking the economic impact of COVID, unpacking the environmental impact of COVID. There's all of these issues being talked about now, like racial injustice and environmental justice, that are coming into play. And I think that's one thing that students often lack in basic introductory courses in college, like most freshmen and sophomores has to take, that are just large lectures and they're not applied to the reality of what they're living in. So for students to be able to understand what climate education means, it needs to come up in formal education, as well as have that curiosity to take it informally outside of the classroom, because the interaction between what you learn outside, what you live, and what you learn inside the classroom is really powerful for helping students understand the impact that they're having.
Thank you so much, Isabel. I think this is important to note that a lot of our panelists today are saying that the relevance of education and making this connection between their lived life and what they learn in the classroom, I think is a very important point that has come up. So now let's ask Shakira, since she has so much of experience in developing curriculum and is teaching in a school setting, to know, what are some of the practice-related challenges and what is the institutional support that you need to overcome those challenges to make education more relevant for the students.
Thank you. And I think it makes sense that I go right after Isabel. Isabel, I hope that my students, when they leave me, that they're as passionate as you are. I agree that we do need to have place-based education. Sometimes it has to be created, like the hydroponic lab behind me, where students are involved in their own education. But however, most students, most teachers don't have the flexibility. Usually teachers are just given set curriculum and said, you don't get to make any changes. This is what you're teaching. Just figure out how you're going to cram it all in. Unfortunately, there's no extra time built into a teacher's schedule. So if we really want to have national climate change education standards or climate change education curriculum, if we really want it to be created in a connected manner, they can't just simply be pushed to the back of the folder, because those tested subjects, the ELA, the math especially, those are the ones that teachers will need to focus on. Why? Because at least here in the United States, teachers have been taught to value testing if they want to retain their job. And their own career is linked to the scores that their students get. I think we can all agree this makes no sense at all. It doesn't make teachers want to work in areas where students have not had as much experience. But if we really want to give time and space for climate change education, our country at least, so we need to place less emphasis on testing. And we just need to give more trust to teachers, that they are experts, that they know their students, that they know how their students learn best. And if climate education standards are eventually created, they really have to be directly connected to the subjects and to the lessons. You know, extra activities are fun, but it's not what teachers need. Teachers really need concrete help in integrating information on climate change into lessons they already teach. Having a mentor who can help a teacher to really figure out where in every lesson can you connect this to issues of climate change. And this could look like, you know, working in small groups with a climate scientist to create meaningful connections to current curriculum. It could be larger courses and then time for one-on-one work. I'm going to say that climate change education, it really needs to be taught from pre-K up through college and beyond. And it should be that constant thread that connects students to the real world. Because if you think about it, what is more real than the effects of global warming? Teachers need to be educated in climate policy. They need to be assisted with integrating climate change education into those existing lessons. And finally, they need to be offered the trust that they are experts who know how their students learn best. When we can overcome those challenges, then we can really be working on climate education policy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Shakira. I think you have just given us all the points that we require to, you know, make all the connections. So thanks for doing that, and thanks for being so precise. We appreciate it. Eveta, you are an international education scholar. So in terms of, you know, your experience, what are some of the research gaps that you have seen in climate change education that you currently see, and what is the potential for comparative focus on climate change education and teaching in the international context and in the US both?
Thank you so much, Radhika, for this question. And it's really wonderful how it relates so closely to some of the issues that Isabel and Shakira have been raising already. So I'll just start by saying that a lot of the research on education for sustainable development and climate change has focused on raising awareness and improving students' cognitive skills, especially in environmental sciences, and also lots of effort and funding have been channeled into developing and implementing competency-based curriculum and related test-based accountability practices to increase student achievement. And even in sustainable development goals, the assumption is that greater access to quality education would result in more sustainable practices. And it's highly problematic. And the problem is that the knowledge and competences that we currently teach, as I mentioned earlier, prioritize not only the logic of infinite economic growth, but also the subjectivity that accompanies this logic, such as the focus on abstract thinking or cognition alone, and not necessarily how we are situated and relate to the places where we are, and the reduction of society to this agglomeration of atomized neoliberal individuals competing for rapidly shrinking resources on Earth. But at the same time, also for decades now, international research and national research has shown that increasing scientific literacy and introducing test-based accountability would not automatically translate into behavior change and action. Research actually shows that we need to also engage psychosocial and action dimensions to address the climate crisis. And Shakira really well summarized some of these interventions. Also, our research in comparative and international education and some research that I do in collaboration with colleagues in Kyoto University and Taiwan National University has shown that first and foremost, we also need to consider the role of culture, which encodes our attitudes and values and strongly affects how humans interact on Earth and with Earth. And by culture, we don't mean a stable set of beliefs or values stored inside people, but rather something materialized in patterns of practices and institutions. And so in particular, We focus on a specific dimension of culture concerning the whole concept of selfhood, including independent selfhood, which is dominant in individualistic societies such as the United States, and interdependent notion of self or selfhood, which is dominant in more collectivist-oriented societies, most countries outside Europe and North America, as well as in indigenous communities. And our research found that countries with dominant independent selfhood, the ones evolving out of the Western cultural experience, have higher CO2 emissions and ecological footprint compared to the ones with dominant independent, interdependent concept of selfhood. In other words, cultural dimensions strongly relate not only with people's environmental attitudes, but also with actual environmental impacts. And so these findings suggest, I think, two key points. One, education is crucial in the environmental education as it has, or in the environmental equation, as it has the power to convey and change culture. And second, we need to fundamentally reconceptualize the how we view education itself, shifting the discussion from knowledge and skills, as well as access and equity, to a more fundamental reevaluation of the concept of self and others, including how we relate to all living and non-living beings. So far, such work has been confined to the periphery of education research, I would argue, in subfields such as comparative philosophy and comparative education, but we need to urgently bring it into the mainstream as part of the sustainability and climate change education discussion too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Evita. Over to Christina for your reflections and connecting with us to, to Frank.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to hear our responses so far from the panel in terms of saying, really pointing us to the direction that we kind of know where the gaps are. We understand what's needed. We know what's desired and what would be helpful, but we don't have the policy structures to perhaps help us get there. And so Shakira notably pointed out the dire need for climate change education policy that teachers can use. And I think this then points me over to Frank, who I've had many conversations about in terms of the US policy context and really thinking about what are the key education policies in the US or what's missing in US education policy that could really help us leverage some of this knowledge to ensure that learners have the accurate, empowering knowledge and information and psychosocial components to really go from climate change learning to climate change action, climate action.
Well, I mean, it's a great honor to be part of this panel. The setup to this question that got to me is just stunning. Evita, you're rocking my world right now. And there's been a lot of other educational researchers who've been really pushing hard, because if we're very serious about actual environmental climate outcomes, we have to understand that humans are the drivers of change on the planet, and thereby humans, how they think and operate and how they get that thought and operate has to be critically evaluated. So I have a lot more reading to do here. But I think what it says, to get directly at your question, Christina, is that the policies we have are not the policies we need. We still need schools. We still need teachers. We still need museums. We still need zoos. We still need, places for learning, like Shakira, the space behind you. But fundamentally, what's going on in the lives of our students and with our teachers and families has to change to the same magnitude that the policies we're talking about, whether you're drawing carbon out of the atmosphere, building resilience, or decarbonizing the global economy within decades. If we're talking about that scale of change, then we have to be thinking about scales, changing scales of how education and the life of our students and teachers works. It's a significant change. And so if you're thinking about the Department of Education grants or the National Science Foundation grants or the state grants and investments in education and professional development, you have to look at all of them, because we're talking about comprehensive change. I think the recipe of what we would like that to be is what we've already talked about, but the architecture of those policies that ultimately generate those outcomes is something that must be required. We must focus at a much more structural level in order for us to get there. We're talking about something much bigger. At one point in time, before the Industrial Revolution, what a school was and who went to school was fundamentally different than during the early industrial revolution to where we are now. So envisioning something that is significantly different than what we are talking about. We're not talking about little tweaks. We're talking about something much size, but at the same time, you still are talking about I used to be a teacher for a long time. I loved teaching. I did not leave teaching because I didn't like it. I loved it. I was just yanked out to do something else. And so, I still see teachers working with students. I see that in the future, but exactly how that's working, I think has to be a much more significant change than what we usually think about. 15 years ago, we didn't think about this kind of structural change. Now we do. But I think that there's I don't know exactly how we're going to answer this question, Christina. But I think sometimes knowing what question to explore would get us to the outcomes that we need. And I think it's a very different examination and approach than tweak. So I think I've got the scale and the focus. I just don't know the process, but that's okay. We've figured out processes before. We can figure it out again if we're able to actually get a large scale structural change. And let's also remember, in the United States, for those of you who don't come from this perspective, education is federalized, and thereby it is fractal in its nature in the United States. It is very distributed. The power structures in education are incredibly decentralized. Even states have that same fractal structures inside them, so not all of them. And so that it requires a very broad engagement strategy for these policies, because there is no national curriculum. There is no national standards. It just doesn't work like that in this country. So there are 15,000 school districts. We have to operate at a 15,000, if not more, level. Thank you, Christina.
Absolutely, and I hope we'll be able to touch on some of that a little bit later through your own conversation that's about to come up. But this leads me really well over to Karen, because Karen, you have been doing some incredible work at 10 Strands over the last couple of years, and really pushing forward this concept of climate change education through the environmental principles and concepts in Californian schools. So I think you probably have a lot of really great insights for the rest of us when we're coming to thinking about these key pathways for progress in climate change education for the US, and then especially more so the key pitfalls to watch out for and to look out for. As not only do we need to know what the questions are, but we also need to know where are the hooks and potentially the areas where we might falter. So would love to hear your thoughts there. You're on mute, Karen.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. I was telling you how great a question it was. so thank you for that. And also how much I appreciate everything that everybody's been saying. Shakira, we work with a lot of teachers, and what you're saying is often what we hear here too. So thank you for all of your remarks. Look, I think the reason we've been able to do as much as we've done in California, and let me say I don't think it's enough, but we have been able to do quite a bit, is because we had the policy roots to the work. And even those policy roots themselves weren't very deep, but just us coming along and sort of shining a light on them made all the difference in the world. So you just need a little thing to hang on to. And but in terms of, I have 4 or 5 thoughts about where this needs to play out. So the first, the first is higher education. So last year, for the first time, we worked with the University of California system, so the UC system and the California State University system, for the very first time, for them to take a look closely at how they might organize to coach and support pre-service and in-service teachers in climate and environmental literacy. So I think that's a very important component, because you want teachers coming into the system who have already, through their methods courses, been exposed to, experienced this approach. So that's number one. They have now gone on. As a result of that exploration with them, they've now gone on, and they are in the process of writing a proposal to stand up a centre focused at one of the universities, but bridged between the two university systems to focus on this topic. The second thing is, and Shakira was getting at this as well, how important it is to not have this work be yet another thing teachers need to attend to, but to think about all of the ways in which this work can be integrated into what teachers are already doing. So our tool for that are these environmental principles and concepts, and we've integrated those environmental principles and concepts into our science, history, social science, health, arts, and now we're working on mathematics frameworks, and we make connections between the frameworks are sort of how-to guide for teachers and how-to guides for publishers. So those environmental principles and concepts are integrated into all of those core subjects, and also linked to our standards. And when we take a step back and we look at the overarching message that's flowing out of all of our frameworks right now, it's that in California, what the State Board of Education wants, what the Department of Ed wants, and what our local controlled districts want is for students to be engaged in inquiry, leading to action in their local communities. So the stage indeed is set for that. But do we really deeply know how to turn our attention to culturally relevant experiences in the way that some of the panelists were talking about, and then obviously also culturally responsive teaching. So those are areas where we definitely have to do more work. So two other things, maybe three other things. In the work that we've done most recently, and in reflecting on the work that we've done over the last 8 years or so, and because of this renewed focus on systemic racism in the country, because of the death of George Floyd and others, we are really taking a deep look at how to center equity, anti-racism, social, environmental, and climate justice in the work we do. And that's a shift. And it's a necessary shift for this work to sort of take hold across all communities. And then another thing that we've really been paying attention to this year is in what way can we as grown-ups in the education system, in the system of support, in what ways can we support student movements? So here locally in Oakland, for example, there's a youth group called Youth Versus the Apocalypse. So in what ways can we support that youth movement? There's another local organization called Youth Climate Action Coalition. In what ways can we support them? Sunrise Movement, Earth Guardians, and others. Because our young people are telling us that they're fed up with how slow we are in all of the work that we do. And so in what way do we organize to support the speed with which A, they want to move, and B, they are moving? And then the last thing, just in terms of how we frame our work day to day, is we're looking for this balance between the upstream activities that we're able to engage in because of the policy work that we do, and then the community-based work that where it really matters, and how do we get across the state enough demonstration sites at schools, in school districts, at county offices of ed, where we can really demonstrate how this work can take place across local systems. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen. I think just learning from those lessons will be key for us to think about how we can localize some of the work that you all have done at scale, the scale that Frank was pointing out in terms of 15,000 school districts, and really thinking about how we can learn and lean on each other's lessons. So I want to be conscious of the time. We have 10 minutes, and I know that we have some folks who might be stuck in their offices if they are not leaving in 10 minutes. So we want to make sure that we can make sure everybody goes home at the right time. But we had envisioned the next part of the panel to be focused on a discussion amongst our panelists to each other. And so we wanted to start off, but I also want to be conscious of the time to see if any of our panelists have a burning question that they'd like to ask each other based on what we have discussed earlier. And if you want to pass, you can pass, but we'll, if not, then let's ask the question. And then I'm gonna have to put in 7 minutes time, I will have to stop us where we are. So we'll get going with this sort of round robin of questions with you all. It's been such an enriching discussion, and I know you all have much more to talk to with each other. So Isabel, turning it over to you to see if you wanna go for your question or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to ask a question to Frank. So climate literacy is usually presented at a global level, the basic fundamentals we learn are greenhouse gases. But as you said earlier, for students living across the country in very different environments, how can we encourage them to be curious about their local environment as a more effective model of climate literacy at an earlier age? And how do you think formal education at scale can help students feel a personal connection to what climate change really means for their communities and landscapes that they can call their home?
It's a crucial question, and I think I'm going to be super brief here, and I'll put a citation to a paper that I think is transforming my thinking. And one of the things to think about is the scale of climate action matches the scale of learning. And as we move away from planetary process and all this like planetary stuff and actually get into the work of solving this problem and these problems, you find yourself working at a community scale. The sweet spot is actually at the 100,000 level. Christina, you know this work very well. It informed my thinking, and so I think the key thing here is that as we move into this new version of climate change education, or education for climate action, the scale of that is really important because they match beautifully, and I think that's what and how you do that across all the units of that scale is a whole nother question, but it's an exciting one to think about, and I think that's actually the where we're going to be going for the next couple decades.
I'm going to ask Karen a question.
Sure. So Karen, I'm going to ask you an easy one. Given how big California is and how diverse it is, and we know that it's not one thing. What are some of the most exciting examples going on in California where you think this intersectional new model of how we would do this? Where do you think that is? And what if you had to point to a bright spot in California? Where is it? Or two, or three?
I would point to Rialto Unified School District as one of my bright spots. They're east of LA. They have a population of students that are 90% Black and brown. And the science coordinator there is basically a community organizer. And she went to the community. She had a mandate to promote science education and career technical education. And she shared with the community that she wanted to do it through the lens of environmental issues in their place. And one of the things that they focused on was the pollution of their water and a relationship that they established between themselves and the local water agency. And so that is certainly a bright spot. I mean, we have a dozen districts who are similar demographics, where we take a look at the percentage of students who are free and reduced lunch, English learners in the foster care system, homeless, and we try to focus on those school districts. And then we overlay a tool that we have called Cal Enviro Screen that looks at the degree to which certain communities are disproportionately impacted. And so we have all of those things at play. And so Rialto is an example of one of those places where all of those things are at play, and yet they're making incredible progress with respect to the environmental literacy of their kids.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Karen, you're over to Shakira.
Well, I want to speak to Shakira like a lot, but and when we could fly, I would come and visit you. But anyway, Shakira. So just wondering what your ideas are on how to move from one teacher in one classroom to taking sustainability education to scale? And what are the main obstacles to your ideas?
Well, how much time do I have? It's a lot of obstacles. I am in a unique position to see the type of education that teachers coming into New York City have. I do, since I work with Math for America Fellows and Science Leadership Team, I do see the other end, the kind of the math and science teachers that are encouraged to stay in the classroom. So I see, you know, from pre-K up through 12th grade, I guess the one obstacle I'd have to say is, you know, time. So when should teachers go off and learn climate change education on their own? Like if they didn't already learn it in college, when should they go do that? You know, when should teachers cram climate change education into their schedules? They're already bursting full. When should teachers find their own time to collaborate? Because we know that collaboration is key if we're going to really design instruction that can connect to real world design and problems and create opportunities for meaningful research experiments. But on the other end, I saw that Alexander Jackson was talking about social justice in the chat there. Bernard Winter was asking about presenting science facts and also with political activism. So this is where it then comes for the students. So teachers need to have time to work together at their own school or people across the globe, but students also need to have this time to work together. They need to learn their information, learn the facts in school, and then be able to bring this information to their clubs, to their activities. Just like Isabel is a member of so many organizations, my students also, they leave 5th grade, they go off to middle school and high school, they're part of Girls Right Now, they're part of Climate Now, they're part of the Youth Steering Committee, they're lobbying, they're learning how to become activists. And so bringing that to the table, I think is also, you know, a real hurdle that we don't always know if we should be talking about social justice when we're talking about climate change. Yes, we should. Environmental justice, right? Climate rights are human rights, everybody's rights. So I just want to say that, you know, teachers do need this time to participate in their own meaningful projects. Also, they need to experience what it means to be a learner, just as their students are as well. So many obstacles, but that's what I can give you for right now. Ivica, if I can ask you a question, I'd love to. So you have recently co-authored a background report for UNESCO's Futures of Education Initiative. That's amazing. Can you tell us more about what type of education might be necessary for our future survival?
Thanks so much, Shakira, and try to keep it really brief and add a link to the report in the chat. But yes, we just finished writing an exciting new report as part of the Commonwealth Research Collective. In this report, we offer 7 visionary declarations on what education could look like in 2050 and beyond. And there are 3 main premises there. The first is that human and planetary sustainability is one and the same thing. We are inseparable part of the ecosystems we destabilize and which now threaten life on Earth as we know it. Second, any attempts to achieve sustainable futures that continue to separate humans off from the rest of the world are delusional and futile, even if the intentions are well-meaning. And third, education needs to play a central role in radically reconfiguring our place and agency in this interdependent world. And this requires a complete paradigm shift from learning about the world in order to act upon it to learning to become with the world around us. And so in this report, we argue that our future survival depends on our capacity to make this fundamental shift. And we offer kind of 7 different steps on how we may think through these ideas. And that links to the question actually that I have for Isabel, because one of the kind of key directions is to really think about how we also take education outside of classroom as well, and how we can learn not only from humans and books and schools and teachers, but also from and with nature. And I know Isabel has some really amazing experience in that area.
Thank you so much for that question. I'm so excited to answer and share this perspective. So I got involved with biomimicry from a random Vox YouTube video my senior year of high school. I just thought it was the coolest principle to look to nature for how we can model our human systems of design and engineering and better align them with nature. And I'll share this quick story briefly. I reached out to them to try and work with them to learn more, again, because this is not something you learn in the classroom. They said they had nothing available for me. Then for a school project, I decided to write an op-ed about how we can look to the 3.8 billion years of evolution to spark a tech revolution for climate solutions. One of the communications directors for the Biomimicry Institute saw my article, asked me to write for them. Fast forwarding about 7 months later, I've written around 8 articles about the different ways that we can look to nature to solve everything from fire resilience to medicine and so much more. And more than just a design principle, biomimicry has been a framework for me to realize that my education is really like an ecosystem, and part of that is interacting and collaborating with all different people from all different backgrounds. It's not just for biologists and engineers, it's for everybody to come together and really know that to come to solutions, you don't need to be an expert in everything, no matter how complex the issue. You just need to be able to work with everybody else. So while biomimicry is exciting in itself, and there are so many examples of the wonderful ways that we can learn from the shapes, forms, and structures of nature, it's also a really great framework that has changed the way that I view my own experience and how I approach new endeavors. And the last thing I'll say on this is that even from my laptop at home during a pandemic, I've been able to speak to CEOs, tech accelerators, and so many incredible people, just learning more about what they're doing. And really in that communication and connection, I have learned so much more, and it's transformed my entire education and how I see my future.
Thank you so much to our panelists. I think it goes without saying that everybody in our virtual space is inspired by each one of you. I think all of the research points to the demand, the desire, and the urgency for us to really transform our education systems for climate action. And we have the examples, we have the real world examples, the classroom examples, and we just need to put that together into a greater political will amongst us all at different scales to really see this happen at scale. So I am so glad that we all were able to have everybody ask each other their round robin of questions. We are 3 minutes over. I believe we're going to get kicked out now, but thank you all so much again, and I'm sorry to our audience that we weren't able to get to the Q&A, but I think we probably answered many of the questions that were on there anyhow. So thank you again. A round of applause, a virtual applause, and I'm not sure what happens next in terms of closing out, but yeah, have a great evening, and we'll see you all in the classrooms. Thank you.